Hi, this is Tanya Becker, and I'm your host for today's episode of PartsVu Xchange Talks Boating. If you haven't already, please subscribe to PartsVu's YouTube channel. Also, if you want to make sure you don't miss out on any of our podcast episodes, subscribe to PartsVu Xchange Talks Boating wherever you get your podcasts. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. I was so happy to have the opportunity to sit down with McKenzie Mungai. Mackenzie is a naturalist for PacWhale Eco-Adventures, an arm of the Pacific Whale Foundation that offers excursions like whale watching, snorkeling trips, sunset cruises, and so forth. This arm of the organization basically funds the conservation work of the Pacific Whale Foundation. She currently lives in a very enviable location, Lahaina, Hawaii. We spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about boating and fishing, and for good reason. Our people like to boat and fish a lot. But the PartsVu community also has a tremendous love of the marine environment in general. Mackenzie has some fascinating experiences and knowledge of whales, dolphins, sea turtles, and other marine animals, truly majestic creatures.
Thanks so much for being here, Mackenzie.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really happy to join you today.
Yeah. So, I'm really intrigued by your work, and there's a ton I want to ask you, but let's start with what drives you. Where did your passion for these amazing marine animals come from?
Growing up in a landlocked state of Pennsylvania, it wasn't every day that I was able to go to the beach and experience the ocean life that I knew I loved so much. But I was fortunate enough to have parents that taught me from a pretty young age about respecting and caring for the environment around me. I've traveled all over the world, and my passion for protecting oceans developed when I was in kindergarten, actually. My parents took me to SeaWorld in Orlando for the very first time, and I was able to see a killer whale at the aquarium, and it was breathtaking for me. I was so inspired to devote my life to protecting the ocean and all that lives within, and 20 years later, here I am, and I've never deviated from that plan.
That's awesome. That's great. If only all of us could find our passions at such a young age, that would be great. From what I understand, humpback whales were very endangered for decades. How did they become so endangered, and what's their status today?
So yeah, humpback whales were very critically endangered, and the species as a whole is actually still considered endangered, but there are 14 populations or stocks worldwide. And so what determines if that stock or population is considered endangered or thriving or whatever their status may be, is obviously the numbers within that population. But however, humpback whales were hunted to the brink of extinction, and humpback whale whaling began in 1819. And it started when 2 New England ships became the first to arrive in Hawaiian waters. During this time, whale byproducts were very high in demand, such as oil, which was used to heat lamps, and whale baleen, used for women's corsets, umbrellas, and buggy whips for horses. Rich whaling areas were actually discovered near Japan and Alaska. And because of Hawaii's central location, hundreds of whaling operations would make a pit stop in Maui, and actually in the Lahaina harbor, which is the harbor that I currently work out of, to restock on supplies. Whaling was also increasing every single year since then, and actually in about 1846, there was a record high number of 734 whaling ships that stopped that year. Around that time, it was estimated that there were more than about 50,000 whales that were killed by whalers every single year. And the humpback whale population was quickly depleting, as you can probably assume. Mm-hmm. However, in the 1960s, there was a song that sparked a movement, and the story goes there was a military researcher who was researching dynamite explosions, and he was recording them. He wanted to see what they sounded like underwater, so he had a hydrophone, an underwater microphone that he would deploy to see what these dynamite explosions sounded like. However, when he deployed this hydrophone, he actually really couldn't hear these dynamite explosions at all. They were muffled out by something that the humpback whales were actually saying. So the humpback whale song is something that these humpback whales today are known for worldwide. And he was one of the first people to actually discover this humpback whale song. And at the time, he had absolutely no idea what it was. But he eventually was able to pass it on to one of the first humpback whale researchers at the time. His name was Robert Payne. And Robert Payne absolutely fell in love with this song. He spent as much time as he could distributing this to recording to as many people. He gave it to musicians, composers, songwriters, friends, family. And his main goal was to raise awareness about humpback whales and ultimately weave them into human culture. And if you ever heard of the Save the Whales movement, this is actually the song that sparked the Save the Whales movement. This song ultimately went on to save their species as a whole. So many people fell in love with these animals and realized just how complex and intelligent these animals really were. And in 1982, the International Whaling Commission put a ban on deep sea whaling. And in 1992, Congress enacted the Hawaiian Islands National Humpback Whale Marine Sanctuary. It's actually one of the largest marine protected areas in the entire world, and the area that I'm fortunate enough to work out of today. So it's very exciting for me and also our humpback whales. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, the species as a whole are still considered endangered today, but the 14 populations are determined based on the migration route. So the population that we have here in the Hawaiian Islands, the North Pacific humpback whales, was actually just taken off the endangered species list in 2016. And right before whaling was banned, there was estimated to be less than about 1,000 humpback whales left in the world. Today, we have a population of over 90,000 humpback whales worldwide.
Wow, that's great. I was able to find one of at least a segment of that original album on YouTube, and I've included a link in the show notes. I think people will enjoy it. It was released on old school vinyl. I think you said that. And yeah, it's incredible. I mean, it really is.
Sorry, go ahead.
Did the songs stay the same? From what I understand, they change year to year or period to period. Is that right?
Yeah. So the humpback whale song is one of the most complex songs. Actually, it is probably the most complex song in the entire animal kingdom. One of the most interesting things about it is that we have determined that only the males are singing this humpback whale song. Another really interesting thing about it is that the song does change year after year. So to put it in perspective, something that we can understand, it would be like if I started singing Happy Birthday, I gave it a couple seconds, you started singing Happy Birthday, someone else started singing Happy Birthday, but slowly over time, I would start taking words away and adding new words, and you would start doing the same thing, but we would adapt to what each other is saying. So that's exactly what's happening in this humpback whale population. So this song does change year after year. So the song that I'm able to hear this season is definitely not the song that I will be able to hear next season. It's composed of different themes and phrases. And we think that when these humpback whales are migrating, like I mentioned, there are 14 populations around the world, they might be passing other populations of humpback whales. And throughout that time, they might be singing that humpback whale song. And each song is unique to each population. So they might be picking up different phrases or themes from other populations around the world and coming here to the Hawaiian Islands and implementing it into this population. And if other whales like that, they'll adapt to it and they'll bring it into their song. The song can also last for hours and hours on end. Most recently, we've conducted a study. Basically, we're trying to figure out what sex of whales were most interested in this song, because traditionally scientists thought that the humpback whales were singing this song because they wanted to attract a male. After all this, or it wanted to attract a mate, sorry. After all, this is the mating and the birthing ground, so of course scientists would think that. In recent years, we have conducted a study and we deployed a recording, basically, of the song from that year. So we play that underneath of our vessel and we wanted to see what whales we would attract. Funny enough, none of the females actually came to the boat at all. So it was just the males that were really interested in this song, which was really interesting because we thought previously that, of course, they were trying to attract the females, but the females don't seem too interested in this song at all. So as of today, we don't actually know why these humpback whales are singing this song, but we do know how they're singing this song. And the way that they're able to sing this song is not with vocal cords like you and I. Instead, they have a series of air sacs all throughout their nasal passage and kind of in the frontal space of their body internally. And in between these air sacs, they have something called a U-fold. And they're able to basically expand and contract this U-fold and run the air through this and in like basically throughout their nasal passage throughout these air sacs. And if you've ever seen a humpback whale, they have ventricle pleats on the underside of them. It kind of looks like an accordion.
Mm-hmm.
They're able to run that air over those ventricle pleats, and they're basically pointing downward at the ocean floor. They're probably about 40 feet below the sea surface. And so it bounces off those ventricle pleats, and it also bounces off the underwater topography. So it's able to travel about 5 times faster underwater. One of the main things that I think is super interesting is that anatomically speaking, both males and females can sing this song, but only the males sing it, which is so, so cool in my opinion.
That is such a mystery, right? I mean, you would think, I mean, obviously a mating song is a natural conclusion. And then you might think that there's, a different, they're relaying information about feeding grounds or something, but that doesn't even make complete sense either, because, you think that would be of interest to males and females. It's so, hopefully we'll figure it out one of these days.
One day, maybe one day. Research is still fairly new. It's only been conducted since about the 1970s. So there's still so many unanswered questions that we have.
That's so interesting. So what species are most at risk today, and what are the largest sources of threat to the animals?
So one of the most endangered sea animals today is probably the harbor porpoise. And a harbor porpoise is a porpoise, but it is going to be in the order of cetaceans. So it's still going to be a whale, dolphin, or porpoise. And you can find them off the coast of California and Maine. They are considered to be one of the most critically endangered cetaceans. Their current population is unfortunately estimated to be about less than 10 remaining in the world. Their main threats are fishermen. They're often caught in illegal fishing operations in marine protected areas by fishermen who are mainly utilizing gill nets. And they're often caught as bycatch. And so the fishermen would basically be going after a target species, maybe tuna or something like that. And instead, sometimes they are unfortunately catching these harbor porpoise, the vaquitas, and unfortunately, sometimes they don't make it. So that is why we have less than 10 in the entire world, which is really unfortunate.
That is too bad. I mean, that just brings, I think in our modern culture, I think a lot of people have forgotten how interconnected things are, and as people, we're really pretty detached, most of us. And one example, I think that you and I have discussed before are in your work are sea turtles, right? I mean, sea turtles eat algae, and what would happen if sea turtles go away?
Yeah, really good question. In my opinion, I think ultimately a domino effect would occur. You basically can't have one species without another type of thing. Here in Hawaii, the main species of sea turtles that we have are green sea turtles and hawksbill sea turtles. But more specifically, we have a really high population of green sea turtles. And as juveniles, they consume both vegetation and other fish, such as squid. However, as adults, they're strictly herbivores. And what this means is that they're primarily consuming seagrass and algae off of the coral reef. And coral needs sunlight to survive. And if it's overgrown with algae, it would suffocate and ultimately decimate the coral reef. So you basically can't have one species without another type of thing.
So sea turtles are kind of the lawnmowers of the reefs. And
yeah, basically. But they keep everything else in check. So it's incredibly important because, like I said, our coral needs sunlight to survive. But basically, our coral sustains about 90% of the life in the ocean. So our sea turtles are literally the basis that are kind of keeping everything else in check, which is why it's really, really important to have our sea turtles.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the fishing industry in general, and particularly the commercial fishing industry, and I think especially there in Hawaii, is moving toward fishing gear that's effective in terms of productive catches, but helps to protect whales, sea turtles, dolphins, et cetera, and other marine animals as well. I mean, what are some of these newer approaches like? I mean, is there anything you can think of?
Yeah, I can think of a few right off the top of my head. I can recall about 2 years ago, the Hawaiian Longline Association was able to replace steel wire fishing leaders at the end of their fishing line with monofilament. This is ultimately a less lethal to bycatch or non-targeted species such as sharks. And when you're catching a shark, they can become very stressed out pretty quickly, and the chances of catching and successfully releasing a shark are pretty slim. The idea behind this change was that the sharks would be able to bite their way free if caught on accident, and the incentive behind this was to cut down on the catching of oceanic whitetips, which are currently listed as endangered, and it's actually estimated that there are less than about 1,500 that are caught while longlining every year, but only 60% of them will survive. So even though about 1,500 of them are caught, only about 60% of them will survive, which is really unfortunate. So it's really great that they're making that change. Another species that is really susceptible to bycatch are sea turtles. They're generally slow moving and typically inhabiting areas where fishermen are deploying trawling nets. Once caught in a trawling net, they're unable to escape until they're brought to the surface because they are air breathing. They'll oftentimes drown and die because they do need to come to the surface to take that breath. One device that I can recall that has been really helpful here is known as a TED, and it stands for a turtle excluder device. It's a mechanism that includes metal bars that are built into your net, almost like a grate. The idea is that anything above 10 centimeters will be unable to enter the trawling net, and then it can escape the nets unharmed. So you can think of it kind of like if you're maybe grilling a hamburger, all your grease can fall through, but your hamburger is going to stay on top of those grates. It's the same thing here for our sea turtles. So our sea turtles will not be able to enter those nets, but instead they will be able to be set free without actually having to pull those nets to the surface and risk any of your other catch kind of escaping as well. So you can protect those species, the sea turtle species, but you can still go after kind of what you're fishing for as well.
Good. I mean, I'm sure that you can probably only speak for Hawaii, or maybe that's not completely true. Maybe you can speak for other areas as well. But are these kind of safer for the marine life mechanisms? I mean, is it being embraced in Hawaii from what you can tell, or are people a little resistant?
I honestly think that the people here are very ocean centric, if you will. Yeah. So they're very inclined to protect everything on the land and in the ocean. So I think that people here are more so open to these ideas and more so adapting to them than elsewhere in the world, specifically just because of the culture here and how inclined they are to protect everything that they really can. Which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. Yeah. Hopefully, I think that momentum is picking up in other areas of the country too, and hopefully world, but let's just keep our fingers crossed that continues.
Yes. Fingers crossed for sure.
So I'm glad that you brought up the native Hawaiian culture. And I think that the culture there is so instructive for taking care of our oceans, our waterways, and land too, as you mentioned. For obvious reasons, Hawaiian culture, as you also said, is pretty water centric. I mean, you're sitting on islands there. It makes sense. What are some of the things that you think that everyone can take away from Native Hawaiian teachings and approaches?
Before I moved here, I was actually not very knowledgeable about the Hawaiian culture or the beliefs at all. So I will say that for the future, I do hope that there can be more sources readily available, especially for tourists who are coming here and people who are looking to move here as well, just so that you're able to educate yourself on a lot of their beliefs before you come here, to also just be respectful to the Hawaiian culture in general. But as soon as I started to learn about their values, I definitely wanted to dive deeper into their culture. It was a culture that I was just really intrigued in. But one thing that I found to be incredibly interesting is that the Hawaiians believe that if you're taking something from the land, you have to give back to it, right? Because if everybody is just taking and taking and taking and not replenishing, there will be nothing for future generations. So in Hawaiian, the aina is the land. So the aina provides so much for us, and it's basically our kuleana, or responsibility in Hawaiian, to become great stewards of the land and the sea so that future generations can thrive off the land and its resources as well. And this is something that the Hawaiians have believed in for as long as, I guess, forever, really. But it's also something that I think that other cultures and other states and countries around the world should be implementing as well. I definitely think it's something that we can even take into our everyday lives. Just think about the future generation when you're taking something.
I agree. I love that sentiment, and I try to adopt it in my life, but it's not always so super easy. But I definitely
Not super easy.
I definitely try, and I think we
Yes,
all need more of that for sure. So thanks so much for being here today, Mackenzie. It was so fun talking to you. And, for our listeners interested in going to Hawaii, or maybe folks are out there planning a trip, I mean, definitely check out PacWhale Eco-Adventures. I've included a link in the show notes. And as I said earlier, I've included a link to one of the many humpback whale recordings that are on YouTube. And as I mentioned earlier, the link I chose to link to is a track from the original 1970 Songs of the Humpback Whale album. I mean, it was such a fun conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks again, Mackenzie.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it too.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the PartsVu Xchange Talks Boating podcast. Are you in a dock war with your boating neighbor for the cleanest boat? Check out our marine soaps, polishes, waxes, and more at PartsVu.com. And for free shipping, use the coupon code PVTalksShine, a special perk for our podcast listeners. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram for boating knowledge, to keep in touch with the PartsVu community, and for special sales and promotions. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast, and check out the show notes for the coupon code just mentioned, more information about PartsVu and the products we offer, as well as our boating blog, the PartsVu Exchange. And a big thanks to Mend for performing the original music featured within this podcast.